Look, we're living now in a very dangerous time. Don't underestimate how dangerous it is.
In what context?
We are being told to hate each other. It's very dangerous, I think, now to democracy. I'm really horrified by reading the paper and frightened. And if I was a British Muslim, I'd be frightened by reading the papers. They have ceased to be, in my view, reporters of facts, but they're purveyors of myths and lies. And that is a very dangerous thing. Journalism, don't think it's anything to do with telling the truth. It's pleasing powerful people.
We have a crisis of information, really. And in fact, can you push it to say that news might be dangerous for you?
No, I do think that on Gaza there has been a terrible failure by the mainstream.
Second aspect, how do we move on from here as far as media is concerned? And you've used the word truth throughout. Try and regain that.
Well, I'll give you some obvious things we must do.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Lanterns of Liberation. We all watch or read the news, but who decide what counts as news? Behind every headline are choices shaped by many forces. Does the owner of the media outlet have influence? How much do the editor's perspectives or political leanings matter? And what about the commercial factor of advertisers whose pounds keep the newsrooms running? Today we are unpacking the politics of news, how power, money and ideology shape the stories we see and the ones we don't. To discuss the politics of news, I have with me an individual who has spent over 30 years observing, recording and reporting on the British political scene. He was the chief political commentator of the Daily Telegraph. He wrote for The Spectator, Daily Mail, and was a regular on BBC programmes Any Questions and Question Time, and often presented The Week in Westminster. Over the years, he has won many awards for his analysis and groundbreaking reporting. He is also the author of numerous books, including The Assault on Truth, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and the Emergence of a New Moral Barbarism. He now writes for the Middle East Eye and other outlets. He is, of course, Peter Oborne. Good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for joining me, taking out your valuable time to join us and enlighten us, really, on Lanterns of Liberation. Peter, just to start off with, what inspired you to enter into journalism?
I'm completely honest with you.
Yeah.
I think I reached a stage where there was almost nothing else I could do. I tried to be a banker a very long time ago, and that didn't work. I was a very bad banker, probably the worst banker there's ever been, I should think. And so after I failed at that in the city, I became a financial journalist.
Okay.
And with great idealism, I thought that journalism is, how you convey truth about, to the readers.
And truth to power as well.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I think there is how should I say, you have to make a choice. If you're in politics, any politician, even as, a man of great integrity or woman of great integrity, they have to duck and dive.
Sure.
They sometimes have to break promises. There are sort of circumstances changed. No, you don't need to be. If you're a journalist, I think what your job is to pursue the truth. That is what I thought.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. You've highlighted in your book, and I think you've written a few other places, that 90% of newspapers read in Britain are just owned by about three multimillionaires, really, through groups of companies. How does this concentration of influence or power shape how the country's thinking and how the people are thinking?
I think it's an enormous problem. Bear in mind, I think I'm right in saying that the three big groups we're talking about, the owners don't pay, they're offshore, not even based in Britain. The most potent of them over the last 40 years, Rupert Murdoch. He's never been a British, he was an Australian citizen, and he became an American citizen.
Bypassed us.
And he's organised he doesn't pay any tax for many years, I believe. I think I'm right in saying. You can't really claim that such a figure has the interests of Britain at heart, and their motives are to sell papers, which there are ways of selling papers, which is a great responsibility to be a journalist. You can do it in a responsible way, tell the truth and are searching questions, or you can just run propaganda and effectively clickbait.
Yeah.
And so I think there is and more recently, there's been a very sinister development. If you read the papers I used to write for in respect, the Telegraph, the Mail, and the Murdoch press, have really gone off the charts. They have ceased to be, in my view, reporters of facts, but they're purveyors of myths and lies. And that is a very dangerous thing because it's the degradation of the mainstream media, which I was very proud to work for many years. It's very dangerous, I think, now to democracy.
You use the word truth. Just the other aspect of that is, of course, independence of the media itself.
Yes.
So how much does this ownership being in a few hands become an instrument of power and privilege, and the impact of that? Because
there's no doubt that the big newspaper owners, whether it was Murdoch, Rothermere, who's the Barclay brothers when they owned the Telegraph, Conrad Black before them, have enormous power because they're read by millions of people every day, and the way they present the world informs and shapes the voters of the country, and they the Sun has claimed general election victories on its influence. The Murdoch papers have, and I think that's right, and I think they played a huge role in Brexit, in shaping that. And so these newspaper owners have vast power. And this isn't new, by the way. If you go back to the 1930s, they were starting to run candidates against the government, the Baldwin national government of the day. And Baldwin confronted them. He said, in a great speech written by the great novelist and poet Rudyard Kipling,
wow.
It said, because Rudyard Kipling was his cousin.
I see.
And he said, power without responsibility is the prerogative of the harlot.
Wow.
That was what he said about the great newspaper owners of the 1930s. And I think that it's fascinating how Baldwin confronted the owners using the language of his very gifted, brilliant cousin, Kipling. And one of the great sadnesses, I think, of the modern generation of politicians is they haven't had the courage to do that.
Would you say more than courage? Many would say actually it's gone the other way around. The politicians are actually courting, wanting to be seen with the owners of the newspapers. And of course, now you might actually argue that the tables are turned, that the politicians are more in need of the media moguls than anything else.
Absolutely. I think I've written several books on this, and I've studied it.
That's why I've invited you.
I've watched this process happen at first hand. And you're right. I think there's been a merger of the political and media class, you might call it. And it's very unhealthy. I'll give you just one tiny example. Keir Starmer, who should be better than this, he should be trying to govern the country, recently appointed a senior communications role in number 10 Downing Street, one of the most important jobs in Britain, the former editor of The Sun, who of course was the editor who hired that awful woman Katie Hopkins, who talked about cockroaches coming, and other terrible things. And so you now have, I was really shocked by this, that a Labour leader could do such a thing, because it's degrading British public debate, and showed you that Sir Keir Starmer, rather than confronting the ugliness and barbarity and the bigotry promoted by the British newspapers, is actually trying to encourage it.
Yeah.
I mean, the language that Starmer used, a nation of strangers, I think was the phrase. I mean, this was deliberate. It was a deliberate attempt to mimic Enoch Powell. in order to appeal to a far-right voter. And for any leader to do this is very dangerous to our country. For a Labour leader with the tradition, can I remind you of a comment made by Harold Wilson, who was rather underrated Labour Prime Minister in the 1960s and 70s, who kept Britain out of Vietnam, unlike Tony Blair, who plunged us into Iraq in order to please the Americans. Harold Wilson said, Labour, i.e. the Labour Party, is a moral crusade, or it is nothing. No. And Harold Wilson really stood up to the racists and wouldn't let them get away with it.
So we've come a long way from those days. You use a term, let me remind you, you call something called client journalism, where you say this is where journalists decorate themselves with power, and they're talking the language of people in power rather than challenging power. Yeah. And obviously what we've just discussed shows that. But how far do you think it's corrupting the legitimacy of democracy itself? Because it's something beyond just, getting votes. There's an undercurrent of mistrust of both politicians and journalists, let's face it. And how much does it sort of feed into the weakening of the fabric of the nation?
Yes, theoretically, the job of a journalist, and this is what you get taught in journalism school, is to hold politicians to account and tell uncomfortable truths. And I genuinely believed this when I became a journalist. And I believed it for quite a number of years. What changed me, and this is when I invented the phrase, I created the phrase client journalist, and it's in my book, The Triumph of the Political Class. Because I was shocked. Couldn't believe the press coverage of the Iraq invasion and the lies told by Blair. And I did a study of the reporting ahead of the war of how journalists didn't just repeat the lies of Blair about weapons of mass destruction. They didn't just fail to be skeptical about them. They went on and invented or used much worse lies. And so they became part of a propaganda machine rather than people who were scrupulously holding people in power to account. And of course, it was completely disastrous because it meant, first of all, the Iraq War we were lied to take us to war. Mm-hmm. There was a parliamentary vote, but Parliament was lied to take us to war. The voters were lied to because they were told that there were these terrifying weapons of mass destruction. They weren't there, and they knew they weren't there. And that is a calamity for British democracy. Yeah, of course it is, because it completely destroys trust in the political process, which should be a uniting process. It should bring it. Politics is there to resolve differences and bring us together. Yeah. But if you have a cynical bunch of liars and cheats at the heart of politics, devising lies to take us into something as terrible as the Iraq War, and the many other things as well. That is a dark thing.
So the lie itself manifests through the fact that there's a collusion, shall we say, between the politicians and the journalists, which shouldn't have been there, bringing a completely new dimension to embedded journalism, I suppose.
Yeah, embedded journalism is a good term.
Absolutely crazy situation. But I just want to go back a little bit about the political class. Would you then say, do you think we're in an era where the political class is not simply the politicians and the legislators in the House of Commons, but the political class is those also who shape the nation, i.e. the journalist. And you have the emergence of the political class that is taking the country in one direction, a direction which might be detrimental, and there's no checks on that. How do you check and balance that?
Well, again, it's a very good question, because traditionally there have been two principal checks. First of all, there's been an opposition party. That's what you learn at school, isn't it, in your politics seminars or whatever. Yeah. That the opposition will hold the government to account. And secondly, there's what they call, is it the third estate or whatever,
Yeah.
the press and the media who will discover difficult things and report. But when unfortunately the two classes, really, the journalists and the politicians, have to a very large extent merged, then of course those two systems break down. One thing I would say here is that we aren't completely bust. We still got the lawyer, the judiciary. Generally speaking, I think our judiciary is it's not faultless, not intact, but it's not faultless. It's not bent, and it is capable of making difficult judgments which upset the government of the day, and it has a very solid standard of evidence, and it has that. That's very solemn. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. When you're standing there in the courtroom giving witness evidence, and so I do think the judiciary. That's why many politicians, are trying to destroy it. By the way, if you look at what Reform is saying about it, what unfortunately Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, is saying. But we do have a judiciary.
Yeah.
But in terms of the function of opposition, we saw this very much with Iraq, with Gaza after October the 7th. You saw the merging of the two parties and the media.
And you have a completely different perspective.
And it was quite a terrifying thing to see.
So we've covered almost the first part to say that the news we are seeing is not necessary. It's to a certain extent being dictated by those in power, and those in power being the political class, which we can talk about, politicians as well as the media journalists. And I'll bring something very personal now to you. Your stint at the Daily Telegraph and your resignation from that. And you mentioned that the advertisers' influence on the editorial content, is what really irked you, and to really move away from a chief editor of a grand daily paper. Give us the story behind that, and how much is that pervasive, or is it just one-off? I think we need to understand how money is influencing news, basically.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the story quite simply. That you say, I had this wonderful job. I was the chief political commentator. Yeah. And I'll tell you that, and his story started when somebody, I'm sure you know, Anas Atakriti, came to my office near here. Actually, I had an office near here. He was on the way to the airport, and he drops in, and he just told me, dropped into the conversation, that life was very difficult because he'd lost his bank account. Yeah. And somebody else actually was in this very building, Azam Tamimi. Then I discovered Azam Tamimi, the same thing had happened to him, and a number of very senior, respected public figures who were Muslim. And if you lose your bank account, by the way, it's now happened to the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. You can't take money out of the bank. You can't go shopping. You can't pay life becomes impossible. You can't pay the utility bills. And it was devastating. I think Anas's wife, who's got nothing to do with, he runs a business. That was, she got, it was awful. And I thought, this is a scandal. And so I researched it very deeply and presented to the Daily Telegraph, which seemed to be glad to receive it, an analysis of how senior British Muslims were being stripped of their bank accounts without any explanation given. And I gave it to the Telegraph, and then it didn't get published after a few weeks, and then a few more weeks. I kept on being fobbed off with some excuse or another. But then I learnt that it was because the chief advertiser, a leading bank, the Telegraph, was the one banning these, cancelling these bank accounts.
So the decision was not being made by the editor himself, but was being made by an external...
In effect, the decision, the paper's news coverage was being dictated by the advertising manager. That's the way I saw it. Okay. And that was unacceptable. It wasn't, because then I started to investigate the Telegraph. Yeah. And I realised it wasn't just with this one story of mine, but there was a pattern of companies being given rather better coverage than they deserved, or stories being blocked because they would upset advertisers. And at that stage, I went through the usual. I wrote about this from Open Democracy. I went through a proper whistleblowing process. I went and complained to the management. I showed them the evidence I'd got, and eventually I did resign. Yeah.
So you felt so. Obviously, you felt that within that structure, the system you were working in, it was operating. How widespread do you think it is?
Yeah,
within the establishment.
At that stage, the general view was that it wasn't specially. Nick Davies, in his magnificent book, I don't know if you know it, on British journalism, the hack. Nick Davies is the journalist who exposed the Murdoch hacking. Brilliant journalist, one of the greatest journalists of our time. And his view was that it didn't happen. He worked for The Guardian, and I'm sure he's... But my view is, I'm afraid, more jaundiced, that the papers are susceptible, particularly now because of the rise of the internet, is killing our papers. And actually, I hate that. I love the newspaper culture. And therefore, they're desperate for cash. And I dare say they are very much open to... I'll tell you one, for instance, I have no evidence to say it, but I have noticed a whole lot of plugs for a leading Middle Eastern country, Gulf state, saying it's a great place to go and live there. And, you don't pay you hardly pay any tax, very good schools. And I have to say, and lots of rather very far-right British citizens, quite well-known ones, have gone to live there, and when they write articles saying that Britain's an awful place, and So I think that now where these articles come from, I couldn't say. But I have noticed a plethora of them. Yes,
we can fill in the gaps. We can fill in. But I think what is very important for our viewers to understand is when they're reading the advert page, especially if it's a full page. It's not only thinking somebody's promoting you that product, but it is possible that the owner of that product is also influencing the news you're reading.
I have no doubt.
So there's two different things here, isn't it?
I think that's right. News is constructed not in order to tell the truth, but in order to promote an ideology or a product or whatever it may be. And that is new. When I started in newspapers, it's an awful long time ago, there was a sort of general... People were happy to have heretical pieces, papers. Even the Daily Telegraph, this news coverage was impeccable. It was about being accurate and fair. Famous for it. The opinion pages were often rather... unsound if you were on the left, but very, very attractive. But even on the they would publish stuff which would upset its readers. Would make them think, treat their readers like grown-ups who wanted to understand what the opposite point of view was.
So, do you think this is one? Is we talked about finance, but we also touched about the social media. Do you think it is them themselves then undermining, not having their views, or they're also being dragged with sort of populist culture through the social media? How much do you think that's playing into it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that we're living in a very dangerous time. Don't underestimate how dangerous it is.
In what context?
We are being told to hate each other. The great thing about Britain, generally speaking, is we've all rubbed along rather well. And that's because we've had this system, the abstract word is multiculturalism, where whatever faith or colour or background, you're welcome here. You're British, but you can be black and British, or Asian and British, or gay and British, or Jewish and British, or whatever it may be. And you don't, obviously you have totally different worldviews, but here we all are in this one country, and it's marvellous because we could Scottish and British, etc. It's Cornish and British, and suddenly if you look at social media now, but also if you read the mainstream papers, which have taken on, in my view, this sort of populist language of hatred. It's about causing us to be divided. It's about making people hate each other, and that's so dangerous so forgetful of all the lessons of history. When you look back at the 20th century, when you get that sort of language and the street language
Yeah.
coming to the mainstream, that leads to violence. It's very frightening. And the fact that our media and many of our politicians, including, I'm afraid, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, is tolerating this sort of thing or encouraging it in some cases. That language, that word, a country of strangers, he's come up with.
Okay, let me sort of change a little bit of subject. You mentioned something about being an independent journalist is pretty good, but you also acknowledge that if you're not close to power, a journalist is punished. Is punished.
Is punished.
Punished in the sense that, obviously you don't get the access to stories, you're ostracized, that kind of punishment. How can you circle that square then? How can you remain independent when you cannot be close to power and they will not allow you to access? I mean, it's becoming impossible to be an independent journalist in a way. Is that the desperate situation we're in?
I think you're right. So I think actually it's worth setting this out.
Sure.
That if you are in 10 Downing Street, you have immense amounts of influence over journalists because you can give them the exclusive interview with the Prime Minister or the leading ministers. You can feed them stories, so the political journalists will get the latest scoop on something. It looks like they're clever. Actually, has been handed it in, for nothing by the press secretary to the Prime Minister. But that, of course, is a payback time. Yeah. And you're not. And the moment you cause problems, the moment that then you're put in what they say, you're put in the freezer.
Okay.
You're put in the freezer, and that's the end. And then your news desk. Why aren't you getting any stories? Yeah. And so it's that is the job of a political journalist is to suck up the powerful people in Downing Street. Sometimes the opposition has a little bit of placing power of its own, so you will get people who will also speak to them. But it does mean that journalism don't think it's anything to do with telling the truth. It's pleasing powerful people.
So, I mean, you, in a way, paint a very worrying picture.
Yeah.
It's a very, very worrying picture. So how do you avoid this route to the freezer? I mean, how?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I think you can say is that the circulations of the mainstream papers are in collapse. They're still very powerful, but they are in collapse. Now, and that means that we have had the rise of a large number of alternative media organizations, some of which I write for. I write for Middle East Eye. I write for Byline Times, which is concentrates a lot on the things the press don't write. And I write for Declassified sometimes, which is remarkable. They've done incredible work, which on a subject which has been ignored basically by the mainstream papers or the broadcasters, which is the British military complicity or involvement in Gaza. Now, that's and there's lots of them. I mean, and I think that these organisations are are getting better and better. Yeah, and I'm very proud to write for them. But the mass media now has really become a propaganda system. Would you like to hear a story about a book I've been reading? It's a remarkable story.
Go on.
In the 1930s, and I'm afraid to say the times we're living through have some comparisons to be made. There was a very great journalist called Claude Cockburn.
Okay.
And I've been reading his autobiography. It's called I, Claude. And
from Claudius, the Roman emperor, of course.
And he was he spoke very good German, and he was in Central Europe, and he realized that the rise of dictators was coming. And he was a communist. He also thought the end of capitalism was nigh. Anyway, he resigned from the Times, so nobody could believe it. If you worked for the Times in those days, it was like about being a papal cardinal or something. And he resigned, and he set up a with a stenograph, a very ancient form of technology. You printed it out, in the top room of some office block near Westminster an alternative system of news. It was called The Week. It came out once a week, and he said what he did was report what's actually happening, as opposed to the nonsense which was reported in the Daily Mail and the Times. And in at that stage, you had Britain was desperately keen to keep on board with the dictators as they were kind of rising, and you couldn't, the Times, for instance, would sort of play down stories which exposed this, and so he developed an information system of journalists who couldn't get their stories into the papers in the mainstream, of foreign correspondents who knew what was going on because they were in Washington or Berlin or Paris, and he broke scoop after scoop after scoop, and very quickly he was being read by almost everybody. It became a pub. You had to get it, and there were sort of dispatch riders outside his door when they published, and warlords in distant China were reading his newspaper, because if you wanted to know, and I think we're at that stage now, that if you actually want to know what is happening, it's no use attending to mainstream media anymore, particularly in foreign policy, but it does apply beyond. You can't rely on these propaganda machines, and so you have to. A new media is developing.
So, that brings a very good point. What I introduce: what makes news? Who decides what's news? I think it's as important to understand that what we do not read or not know about is maybe more important than what we're reading about.
That's right, There's no question about that.
It keeps you blind. And that decision-making, first, there'll be a lot who would argue it's more Eurocentric or sometimes more British-centric, shall we say, in our context. But it's also ideological now with the New World Order. And that also goes back to our very first discussion about, a few people owning the media itself. And you're talking about creating this alternative. Do you think the social media will break that? Because now we're trying to, especially with Gaza, we are getting our sources, or most people, are from the ground, from the people who are reporting from their iPhones. From the
and the very brave journalists who've, so many of whom have been killed by Israel. Incredibly brave people, men and women in Gaza, who are bringing the truth to the world. And one of the disgraceful things about the mainstream media is the deaths of these, the slaughter of these journalists is not properly reported in British mainstream media. That is an example of how you cannot understand what is going on in the world. What's it called? The Centre for Media Monitoring produced a fantastically interesting report on the BBC.
That's their bias on.
Well, because you cannot. The BBC, according to the Centre for Media Monitoring, didn't tell its viewers or listeners, or perhaps only in passing, about those genocidal Amalek remarks.
Quotes by Netanyahu.
Now, you can't understand what is going on in Gaza without knowing about those remarks. And indeed, the British government has to know, because every time it signs off an arms deal, it has to make a judgment about whether it's in breach of international humanitarian law. And the fact that so many Israeli leaders have used genocidal language tells you an awful lot about intent, which is was a key point. Likewise, the Ahia doctrine. That was an official Israeli military doctrine, which was developed in 2006 when the slaughter of civilians in Lebanon. Now, and that is a doctrine which was then developed, and it's been applied in Gaza. But if you don't tell the BBC readers, listeners, or viewers haven't been told about the Ahia doctrine hardly at all. And that means that they can't assess that isn't a barrier to allowing them to understand what's going on in Gaza.
Even about the refugees and UNRWA
UNRWA,
That's so we have a crisis of information, really. And in fact, can you push it to say that news might be dangerous for you?
Yeah, I know. I do think that on Gaza there has been a terrible failure by the mainstream.
That's very, very painful. In the same line, of course, getting it more broadly, the rise of the far right, if you want to call it neoconservatism, rise of racism, Islamophobia. How much is that fed through the cycle of the media and not presenting the case as it should be, in particular if you think about how migrants are portrayed,
Yeah, I know.
the
This
language
is
that
one
is
of the
used.
central problems of our time.
Yeah, so how much do you think that positions itself, the racism vis-a-vis the media?
Yes, I'm really horrified by reading and frightened. And if I was a British Muslim, I'd be frightened by reading the papers. And it should be said it's also on social media. So it isn't.
Yes.
If you look at Twitter, or I still think of it, but I think it's named.
I've been told it's for the middle-aged men. Twitter is. Now they've gone to Instagram.
It's called X, by Elon Musk. You know, he's promoting Tommy Robinson, and now this is a fascist thug, a racist fascist thug, and he spreads lies about minority groups in Britain. And that's being spread out, and the lies in social media doesn't have the same disciplines of evidence-based research that mainstream media ought to have. But what you then get is the mainstream media, also the papers like the Express, Mail, Telegraph, and so forth. They entertain these lies, all these falsehoods. And they're not reporting them responsibly. The current last week's Reform conference had some appalling stuff. The celebration of this woman Connolly who came out of jail.
Yeah.
Now there was sort of naked racism on display. Now this is very dangerous in our country, in any country. I mean, it's. And we had a fight about this in Britain, not a physical fight, but a political fight, if you go back 60 years, when Enoch Powell was driven out of the Conservative Party by Edward Heath. And it was after making awful remarks about our fellow citizens in Wolverhampton. Sure. Yeah. And we thought that language had gone, but it's been brought back. One of the things I think which we need to understand better, and I mean to do some work on this, is a lot of it comes from the States.
Yeah.
It's part of this sort of Trumpian world of where they entertain racial hatred. They're trying to reverse the Civil War almost.
How much of that do you think is a failure of their political ability to deliver what the people want? And also this vision or delusion of grandeur of certain aspect of what they should be or were, and feeding into that cycle. And the only escape then they have is to punish the ethnic minorities, whoever they may be.
I think there is that. I mean, it's a very complex subject because, and this is rather too simplistic a way of saying it, I think, that there are massive problems of equality and justice in our society. You know, one of the things, you and I are probably roughly the same age, and the rise of extreme wealth and the return of poverty and the end of we were brought up in a fairly equal country. It was sort of social democratic. And we've now got extremes of wealth.
That division.
Disparity. And the people who own the newspapers and the media are very rich as a whole.
Absolutely.
And it's quite convenient if you think that the incomer is your enemy.
Yes.
And you because he's a different skin color to you, or a different religion, or work.
Or they're the cause for your wealth gap, or they're the cause because you don't have a hospital appointment. They're the cause because you're not enjoying life. I mean, that's a very short-sighted, I suppose, almost.
You see, it's important to. I read George Orwell a lot, who came of age as a writer in the 1930s. Lived through World War II, and he's expressing a basic decency about who we are as
Yeah.
British people. We stick together, we're humane, we're compassionate, we stick up for the underdog as we did in World War II. And that lovely heritage, very rich heritage, we're about communities.
Yeah.
Not about who I am, it's who we are.
But does the
Maggie
we...
Thatcher said about this, by the way. It's quite, it's something's happened to the Conservative Party. It's moved away from this collective sense of public decency.
Let me probe you on that. Is the we in the 1930s of Britain white we, and the we of today is not the white or whiteness? Do you think there's this disjuncture which then destabilizes that we factor, and then the immigrants are seen as the problem?
Yeah. Remember in the 1930s, it's one of the wonderful things which happened in Britain that we had that and in the 40s, there's very large, significant Jewish immigration from the, and which really added to the strength of our social culture.
But sorry to interrupt, but at that stage, the Daily Mail was writing about the Jews exactly
Yes.
what they're writing about the immigrants today.
Yeah, I know they are. They were.
Yeah.
That's right. That is true.
So it was, they were the pariah. They were the...
That is in the media.
They were the people who were corrupting the country.
That was the media. Quite some of the
Yeah.
media. I haven't studied it actually. But yeah, that was some of the media reaction. But as a country,
Sure.
we came together to welcome immigrants, particularly, and then after the war too.
Yeah.
And that became part of who we are, and always were, because of course there's always been waves, the Huguenots or the Irish. I mean, there's waves and waves of immigration to this country.
Okay, we've discussed about ownership, financial advertisement and influence. I want to shift the subject a little bit, still to about influence, but think tanks. They are sort of propping up more and more. They are the specialists in our media faces. They are the talking heads. How much does these think tanks influence the government and the media as well, and the impact of that? Because, of course, to have a think tank, just to preempt, is you need resources, you need finances, but you also need, very similar like journalists, access to power.
There's another part of my growing up. When I was young, I believed this thing. It said think tank. And I thought, there's all these awful clever people sort of thinking up ideas which will make the world a better place. And it took me a long time to realize they weren't. They were owned by largely anonymous, very rich men. And
now most probably foreign as well.
And American. I think they have been used as a vehicle to capture British public life. Largely, in my limited understanding, but this is something that's a wonderful person called Peter Begiogan, who's done a lot of work on this. I urge you to have him on.
Okay.
Who's done some really interesting work on the kind of funding of these think tanks. And I think that public relations is just a bit too... If you call yourself a public relations firm or a lobbyist, you're giving the game away. If you call yourself a think tank, everybody thinks you're, they're thinking, they're clever chaps. And of course, they're the same. They are paid... Some very rich man, or very rarely a woman, wants to promote some idea. He then hires all these clever chaps, gives them lots of money to sell his idea. Now, in some cases, it might just be a change on the law to help enable his product to sell. In other cases, it's pernicious. It's a political idea, maybe that the these foreigners are coming and they're replacing our culture. I'm very worried about the influence of the circle of people around Trump now. I didn't like J.D. Vance's visit to Gloucestershire and the visits from senior British right-wing politicians to Vance while he was in Gloucestershire. This looked to me like foreign interference. Have you noticed the way that the right-wingers, the reform people, they're always going about bring back British culture and all the rest of it, but they're bringing back full of very smelly, ugly American ideas, and I think financed by very smelly, sinister, whiffy Americans. We don't tend not to know who they are. This is something, and they come from the circle which has backed Trump. They are racist, I think. They often, and they're wanting to turn Britain from the country which Orwell's Britain to some other dystopian nightmare.
But isn't this role should have been fulfilled, as I think you have identified it somewhere, by civil servants?
Yes.
Our politicians
Yeah.
should be informed by civil servants.
Now, that is what they've done. The think tankers have quite stealthily taken over the traditional role of the civil servant. This is part of the thing, one of the worst things which the new generation of politicians do is they trash the civil service. And then you bring in somebody from a think tank. Nobody knows really who he is, what he's done, but he's got an agenda, and the agenda tends to be to pick apart, destroy the NHS, and make it profitable for American health corporations or something like that. And it's not. Nobody really wants to report it. It's not reported by the mainstream media, which is, on the contrary, will often run sort of glowing pieces for some think tank boffin, saying this is how we got it. The NHS doesn't work. This is how it got to be done, and if mysteriously it will involve lots of foreign companies creaming it off.
A few short questions, fire rounds, as they say.
Yes.
How should the viewers, when they're digesting news, try and understand it and be protected against the biases that it might origin from?
Yeah, I think you have to be. I'd simply say don't read.
We can't do that. We have to.
Yeah, I would say, well, be on your guard. Check out who is the person writing this article.
That's very important. So the author.
Yeah, and look at their reputation. Can you trust that person? I would recommend going on social media, but be very careful because it's full of frauds.
Yes.
And people who have millions of followers but are actually conspiracy theorists and say things which seem sensible but actually take you down very dark places. It's a jungle, so it's very hard to know if you're entering this jungle what's going on and who is trustworthy and who.
Second aspect: how do we move on from here as far as media is concerned? And you've used the word truth throughout. Try and regain that for journalists, and therefore we can hopefully have a better populace, a better population, well informed, so that as a nation and as a people we can hopefully come to make the right decisions to move forward.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you some obvious things we must do. Was ban foreign ownership of British newspapers.
Okay.
Thing one. Two, anybody who owns a British paper should pay British tax in full.
Okay.
Anybody who dodges tax is not allowed. I mean, banned from owning British newspaper. Three, you bring in. We had something rather good. It was called the Monopolies Commission. You couldn't control more than 25% of the market. And now the Murdoch Group. 25% maximum. I might even make it 20%. Yeah. Then I think you would have you have to strengthen the regulator. People present regulators as somehow bureaucratic and a barrier to entrepreneurialism. The fact is, you need to have standards of truthfulness. There must be punishments if you spread a pernicious doctrine. I also related to this. I think the Equalities Commission has to wake up. I mean, it's basically allowed this. I mean, why isn't there an Equalities Commission investigation into reform? Or the Conservative Party? I mean, nakedly bigoted parties, but they're not interested. And there must be a reason why that is, but I would be interested to know why they. But in other words, the state has to be able to regulate public discourse to stop the bigotry and hatred we're now seeing.
Let's end on a good note. What silver linings do you see with it, especially the new generations that's coming towards understanding the world better?
Do you know, I'm very, that is quite, oddly enough, I'm very encouraged by all of that. Whenever I meet young people, as we both, I think they're awfully clever and nice and well-mannered and decent as a whole. And actually, it's one of the most encouraging things. I don't know if that's your experience.
Yes, it is. And they're willing to go the extra mile to do stuff.
Yeah. And so bring back the doctrine of service and duty and curiosity. And also, I think, I'm a fan of the present king, by the way. I think he's marvellous. But think of the lessons of the late Queen, you know, that sense of duty to country.
Yeah.
You remember, and that total lack of prejudice she had, you know. Sort of, remember when Michelle Obama came to, and you know, that everybody was welcome. That sort of multiculturalism of the late Queen, which was, and the current king, by the way. These are, and the sense of duty and decency, and that is what, and true patriotism. Because do you remember what you're seeing at the moment is an attempt to steal patriotism.
Yeah.
And you know, the flag, using it as a weapon against minorities. That's what's happening. But actually, the flag is there to say we're all in it together.
Peter, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. You have been sort of really lightening the topic and giving us an insight into actually how the media works. So thank you very much.
A pleasure. Thank you for talking. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks.
Dr. Ismail, we just had Peter Oborne on, who really unraveled the world of journalism for us. But my question to you is, what was the most eye-opening conversation you had with Peter?
I think the ability to understand how news is formed. I mean, he mentioned that he was so despondent. He at one stage says, "Don't read." I don't think he meant that literally. I think what he was trying to say is that, you know, the news is so, should we say, corrupted, you know, from its sources, its producers, its outlets. So be careful what you're reading. Don't consume everything. I think we can draw an analogy. It's like not just eating everything you come across. Be careful what you eat and what you put in your body, because that will impact on your body. Similarly, I think what you read will impact how you think, and news will influence the way you look at the world.
Absolutely. And from your conversation with Peter, has the way you consume news, has that perspective changed at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'll be more attentive to who I'm listening to as a presenter and which outlet. And there are two things, I think. So who's actually presenting that news, but who owns that company?
Exactly.
And I think those two things they go hand in glove, and we should be careful. And
what would your message be to somebody that says, well, there's just too much information out there. I don't know what's true. I don't know what's false.
I think it's a difficult task, but you can walk the middle line and inform yourself and gather the news in a way that is not harmful and that is almost getting to the truth. But more importantly, and I think that this is the most important point, remember what is not reported. Because it's not in the news doesn't mean something not important is happening around the world. Most of the stuff we read is because it's important to the journalist or the media company.
And for our listeners, what do you think is the key indicators of finding out whether a piece of information that's presented, whether that's on social media or any news outlet, is true or is false, and how do they go about finding more information about that particular topic?
We don't want to get too technical because, I mean, if you're a student, a journalist student, then you'd want to check with the alternative sources. But I think if it doesn't feel right within you, then question it immediately.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's the bottom line.
And for all of us that aren't journalists out there, how do we combat the narrative?
I think always have an alternative source on any subject you're following. So you might want to listen to the mainstream, fine, but make sure you also follow some expert in that area.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If this conversation sparks something in you, share it, talk about it, and keep asking the difficult questions.